Ice shelf. 10:43 a.m. "Come in," Stokes said without looking up from the map spread out on the wide wooden table. He hadn't slept for 2 nights and didn't care if it sounded rude. The work schedule approved by the Hook Petroleum Board of Directors was hopelessly delayed, and now David was doing everything he could to make up for the time lost, due to the Arctic storm that had been raging for 3 days. The door creaked open. John McKinley, the head of the second team of geologists, squeezed into the room with difficulty. McKinley was about 35 but looked older, possibly due to his impressive size. John looked more like a giant wrestler than a geologist. Among the expedition members, he was known for his strength and good nature, which did not prevent him from being demanding and sometimes tough on his subordinates. But now, his thick jacket was heavily covered with snow, and a crust of ice had formed on his black and graying beard and around his mouth. "Excuse me, sir." McKinley was breathing heavily from his quick pace. David looked up from the map with some annoyance, but immediately realized something had happened. The giant was nervously shifting from foot to foot and was clearly alarmed. "Yes, John, speak." "We have a problem?" McKinley's deep voice filled the room. "During work on the shelf, one of the workers fell into a crevice." Stokes closed his eyes for a moment. He had wanted to wait out the storm at the base for a reason. He had a bad feeling. "Who?" "Harry Cole. He's one of the new guys, been here just a couple of weeks." "I know who Cole is, John." Stokes frowned. "What's his status? Did you get him out?" "That's the problem, sir. We can't find him." "Why?" McKinley hesitated and sighed. "Well, it's not a typical crevice." "What do you mean, not typical? Speak clearly." The foreman bit his lip, trying to find the right words. "You see, sir." He finally forced out and wiped his broad palm across his forehead. "It's not like a regular crevice. It's a huge cavity. We tried to look into it from above, but we can't see anything, not even the slopes. Without equipment, we can't find him." "Understood." Stokes wearily ran his hand over his face. "What about the radio?" "Silent." David sighed heavily. "When did this happen?" "At 9:30 a.m. John wiped his hand again. "I left Frank there in case Cole contacts us." Stokes thought for a moment and looked at his watch. "How many people are at the base right now?" "The first team is still here, sir. They're scheduled to leave in an hour. So besides us, there are 4 more." "Okay. Can you mark the location on the map?" McKinley quickly crossed the room and approached the table, leaving wet footprints on the wooden floor. He bent over the map, traced his finger over it, and nodded confidently. "It's here, sir." His finger pointed to a spot about 1.5 miles west of their base camp. A hole in the ice, a little over 3 feet. Probably, the ice shifted after our work. Stokes carefully examined the point indicated by the foreman. On snowmobiles, especially in this hellish weather, it would take about 40 minutes to get there. But they had to hurry. Cole wouldn't survive long in the cold if they wasted time. Since the Arctic was opened for mineral extraction, many oil giants had rushed here, and Hook Petroleum was one of them. However, before placing equipment on the vast, snowy expanses, companies sent groups of geologists to precisely determine the boundaries of the oil deposits. They tried to follow safety protocols, but the managers often cut costs, leading to several worker and engineer deaths each year. These incidents were carefully hidden from various commissions. But even if the state showed interest in a particular incident, money always did its job, and it was quickly forgotten. Stokes had worked for the company for many years and knew that the management would prefer a purely formal approach to rescue operations. but his subordinates respected him precisely because they could rely on him in any situation. He valued his people, and they were ready to do anything to work with him. Stokes ran his hand over his face again and rubbed his tired eyes. He desperately wanted to sleep and was practically collapsing from exhaustion. A couple of hours of sleep. "Call Bradley to me," he finally said quietly, "and prepare the equipment for 3 people with Steve, a couple of generators, and 3 powerful spotlights. Tell Stevie that he's coming with us and warn the rest of the guys. We're leaving in 15 minutes. "Yes, sir." McKinley gave him a quick, apologetic glance, nodded, and heavily left the room. Stokes looked at the map again and pondered. The 50-degree frost almost gave Cole no chance of survival, and a fall from a great height practically reduced those chances to 0. But he believed in luck. Once, 20 years ago, he had also been lying at the bottom of a 30-foot crevice on the slope of Elbrus, unable to move even a finger, and the vast world had become for him only a distant, unattainable piece of blue sky overhead. Life was ending, like water in a glass being drunk in greedy gulps. But he was found and saved. Only scars reminded him of that fall, and also a half-forgotten feeling of that insane joy experienced by a person who had lost all hope. A new knock on the door made David startle and return from the past. Joe Bradley, the head of the first team, entered the room. Unlike the giant McKinley, he was lean, of average height, and not at all good-natured. A former Marine, Bradley had a tough character, which Joe, fortunately for many, more than compensated for with military discipline. David had been working with him for several years and trusted him as much as himself. "Are you aware?" Stokes stepped away from the table and stopped a short distance from Bradley. The floorboards creaked under his boots. "Yes, sir. McKinley told me about Harry. I hope the guy is alive." "So do I, though the chances are slim. But I called you for something else." Stokes stepped closer. "I have a request, Joe. If the company finds out we're undertaking a hopeless rescue operation in the face of a scheduled delay, they'll skin us alive." Bradley nodded in agreement. "Make sure the guys don't talk too much afterward, especially over the radio." "Understood, sir." "Excellent." Stokes patted him on the shoulder and looked at his watch. "I think John's ready. You're coming with us. I need your help. Let's go." 12:50 p.m. "We're here, sir." McKinley's voice was barely audible in the speaker amid static and gusts of icy wind. "Got it, John. Stop, guys." Stokes stopped the snowmobile. The powerful engine growled a couple of times and died. He straightened his stiff back with relief, wiped the snow from his glasses with his fingers, and looked around. Visibility was no more than 15 feet, and the sun barely broke through the haze of thick snowflakes. To the right, the other snowmobiles were visible, and ahead, about 20 feet away, the faint outline of a red tent could be seen, its canvas walls billowing under the fierce gusts of wind. A lone figure stood near the entrance. Stokes got off the snowmobile and only then noticed the fence of bright red flags a little away from the tent. Damn. He shook his head in disapproval. It was against safety regulations to leave people so close to crevasses. McKinley had been asking for a reprimand for a while. "Frank? It's Stokes," he almost shouted into the radio. "Do you hear me?" There was static and clicking. "Yes, sir. Step away from the tent and join the others." "Understood, sir." The snow-covered figure slowly moved towards the snowmobiles. "Bradley?" "I hear you, sir." More static. "Take the rope. Tie it to one of the machines. Then approach the flags. Be careful, Joe." "Yes, sir." Stokes headed towards the fence. Walking was difficult. The wind beat against his chest in tight jerks, and he struggled to stay on his feet to avoid collapsing into the snow. He saw the hole immediately. It loomed ominously in the ice between the flags and was exactly as McKinley had described it, no more than 3 feet in diameter. David approached closer and crouched. Around its edges he could see thick, about a foot thick dark gray ice dusted with snow. It was definitely not a crevice or a crack. David thought it looked more like a hole that kids poke in an eggshell with a thick needle. He turned over his shoulder. Bradley was already standing 5 feet behind, waiting for orders. "Throw the rope and secure me," he shouted. "I want to take a closer look at this damn hole." Bradley nodded, swung wide, and threw the end of the rope to him. Stokes stood up, wrapped the rope tightly around his chest a few times, then clicked the carabiner shut, crouched again, and crawled towards the edge. He crawled cautiously, not wanting to accidentally collapse this dome of snow and ice. His suspicions had already grown into absolute certainty. It was indeed a dome that could hide an enormous crater of an ancient extinct volcano beneath it. If this were the case, they needed to exercise maximum caution to avoid all falling in after poor Cole. Finally, he stopped at the edge and looked down, clutching the uneven edge of the ice with his fingers. Below him yawned absolute darkness. It stretched in all directions, and for a moment Stokes felt as if he were lying on the edge of the world, looking into an infinite abyss where there was neither time nor space, only darkness and terrible cold. He stared in fascination at the white snow swirling above this black void, driven by sharp gusts of wind, slowly descending into it until it completely disappeared into the bottomless depth. He had to shake his head to snap out of it. Something terrifying and dreadful was in this sight. He turned on the flashlight. The bright beam cut through the darkness and went down like a thin needle under the lower edge of the ice. David hoped to see part of a stone wall or an icy slope, but no. The beam gradually extended into the distance and dissipated, as if devoured by thick, viscous darkness. He crawled closer to the edge, hung his hand down, and began to move the flashlight side to side, trying to see at least something in this pitch-black darkness. Again, nothing. David rolled onto his back and grabbed the radio. Harry. Harry Cole. Over. He waited a few seconds and repeated. Cole. It's Stokes. Over. Cole. Cole. Respond. The static in the radio intensified, but the air was silent. Cole either couldn't respond or was already dead. In any case, David had to make a decision, and he did. Stokes lay on his side and waved his hand towards the snowmobiles where McKinley stood. "John?" he shouted into the radio. "Yes, sir? I'm going down. Joe will secure me." Bradley waved his hand, confirming he heard. "Keep calling Cole. If we're lucky, I'll notice his radio or hear it when I'm descending." "Got it, sir." Stokes got on his knees and removed the rope from his chest. He needed to put on special equipment for the descent, otherwise the tight loop would just break his ribs. Then he pulled safety harnesses from his belt pouch, put them on, tugged hard, tightening the fastenings and simultaneously checking their reliability. Then he clipped the carabiner to the safety ring and started feeding the rope down. "Joe, give me 30 feet." "Yes, sir. 30. The rope slowly disappeared into the darkness. 5 feet. The storm was gradually subsiding, and the snow no longer lashed at his face so fiercely. 20 feet. Stokes squeezed and unclenched his hands several times to warm his palms. "Ready, sir. 30 feet. Bradley's voice reached Stokes as if from afar. He was staring into the black, bottomless depth. A bad feeling squeezed his heart with cold again. 1:35 p.m. He was surrounded by complete silence from all sides. David even felt a faint ringing in his ears. A long time ago in his youth he read that it was normal and that we usually don't notice it due to louder sounds. But if we find ourselves in silence, then we hear it and think something is wrong with us. David smiled at his thoughts, trying to relax a bit and calm his trembling. He was hanging 10 feet below the breach. The sounds of the storm and the whole familiar world were somewhere above. Light still penetrated here, but it quickly got lost in the darkness, dissolving in it like a drop of paint in a jar of water. For a moment, Stokes even thought he was very much like bait lowered here for an unknown, hungry monster. And right now, deep down, a giant grinning face would flash, greedy eyes would gleam, and in a second it would all be over. David involuntarily pulled up his legs and shivered. He knew how to endure fear, and it often saved his life. But now his fear was different. It was not ordinary fear. It was fear of the unknown. Fear of what awaited him down there, in the terrible black depth. Cole, over. McKinley's voice came through the speaker. Cole, over. Slowly swinging on the rope, Stokes pointed the flashlight upward. The spot of light slid over the icy dome, reflecting off tiny crystals in bright splashes. For a second, the beam caught a black surface, and he quickly brought the flashlight back. Incredible. His hand gripped the flashlight and started moving in a circle around the hole, through which the snow was slowly flickering in the dim light, falling. It seemed that the ice-covered sparkling dome hung in the air without any support. But looking closely, Stokes realized that the ice layers lay on an absolutely black base, extending far to the sides, forming another, even larger dome. Cole, over, Cole. The voice in static came through the speaker again. David once more swept the beam over the black dome. It extended at least 30 feet and practically merged with the surrounding darkness. Bradley, over. Radio noise. I hear you, sir. Bradley's voice was interrupted by static. Give me another 30 feet. Yes, sir. The rope slowly and smoothly went down with Stokes, and the hole in the ice began to recede, gradually shrinking in size. He leaned down and waved the beam beneath him. There was still no sign of the bottom, but it was already clear that Cole was dead. No one would have survived a fall even from such a height. He continued to glide down, feeling not only fear but also some curiosity, like a child who is terribly afraid of what awaits ahead but keeps running further, unable to stop. Stokes nervously glanced around, trying to catch in the flashlight's beam at least a faint hint that the bottom was near or that the walls were narrowing towards the center, as in a volcano crater. The 30 feet ended, and the rope stopped. He was already 40 feet deep. Cole, McKinley's voice sounded again. Cole, respond. Again, silence. Stokes slowly swung side to side in the pitch-black darkness. The tightly stretched rope creaked slightly. There was still no sign of the bottom below. Bradley, feed another 30 feet. Over. Yes, sir. Another 30. The rope went down again. 5, 10, 15 feet. Stop, Stokes suddenly breathed out. Something white flashed far below and then vanished into the darkness. 2:20 p.m. The descent ended. Stokes unhooked the carabiner and felt relief as his feet touched a solid surface. The last half hour felt like an eternity to David. But he finally reached the bottom of the cave and now stood knee-deep in snow, exhaling thick white vapor into the icy air. No light penetrated here. If he turned off the flashlight, everything around would plunge into absolute darkness and complete silence. There was no snowstorm here, not even wind, but it was just as cold as above. David looked up. The hole was over 120 feet above, looking like a small star against the night sky. He stood on a large, roughly 50 by 50 feet, snow-covered platform. The deep snow reached his waist in some places. He thought the snow had been lying here for centuries, maybe much longer. He felt eerie about this place. Never in his life had David seen anything remotely like this cave. The flashlight's beam still got lost in the distance, not reaching any obstacles. Perhaps the reason was the rock in which the cave was made. Absolutely black stone seemed not to reflect light at all, but absorbed it, like a sponge. Stokes realized the cave was man-made during the descent when he saw almost perfectly even ground beneath the snowdrifts, made of huge black blocks. 15 feet to the right, a large dark red stain was visible on the pristine snow. That was Cole's body. He lay with his arms wide apart and his neck and left leg twisted unnaturally. Harry Cole no longer needed help. He was dead. But David was interested in something else. He was interested in what accidentally caught the flashlight's beam and completely changed all his plans. 3:10 p.m. McKinley. Bradley, do you hear me? Over. The radio static grew stronger, then completely subsided. Bradley, McKinley. Over clicks and a sharp sound like a siren. Another loud click. We hear you, sir. It's Bradley. Found Cole. He's dead. Stokes paused a little. I need to look around. I'll be in touch in 10 minutes. Understood, sir. In 10 minutes. The snow crunched loudly under Stokes's feet as he moved forward. A few feet ahead, the flashlight's beam picked out what had so intrigued him. A huge obelisk, about 15 feet high, glittering with ice and snow crystals, not far from Cole's body. Stokes approached the obelisk, stopped, and began moving the bright beam over its surface, carefully examining every detail of this unusual structure. Indeed, it had somewhat strange outlines for an obelisk. Its base rose about 2 feet and was shaped like a square with sides about 10 feet. On one side, under the snow, the outlines of wide steps were discernible. At the base stood an enormous cube over 7 feet tall, one corner of which, closest to the center of the cave, was cut diagonally, and almost in the center of this cut, either another smaller cube or a sphere rose. The outlines of this object, and the cube itself, were hidden under a thick layer of snow and ice. Stokes exhaled white vapor and looked around again. The enormous size of this cave both frightened and attracted him. He was curious about what lay further, in the darkness. He circled the obelisk and headed toward the edge of the snow, visible about 30 feet to the right. Walking was difficult. Ice lay beneath the snow, causing Stokes' feet to constantly slip, and he expended a lot of energy to keep his balance and not fall into the snow. A couple of times he did fall, but he got up and kept going. Finally, he reached his destination. The snow was shallow and barely covered the black stone blocks. David shone his flashlight on them, then squatted down, took off his thick glove, and ran his hand over the stones. The surface was rough and very cold. He had encountered this material before. The huge blocks were carved from black obsidian volcanic glass, but he had never seen such dark stone. The largest deposits of obsidian were in the US and Mexico, but here in the Arctic it couldn't be unless it was brought here deliberately. But in such quantities, and by whom? Stokes stood up and pointed the flashlight into the distance. The dark blocks extended further in all directions and were lost in the darkness. He felt scared again. Bradley, over. Yes, sir, I hear you. We're staying here for now. What happened? I can't explain. You need to see this. Understood, sir. Silence returned. Stokes stood in place for another minute, peering into the dense darkness ahead of him. then turned and cautiously made his way back to the obelisk. 4:55 p.m. What is this? McKinley looked around with curiosity and, at the same time, with apprehension. He tried to speak loudly to drown out the noise from the generators. I don't know. Stokes walked over to him and stood beside him. 2 spotlights brightly illuminated the pedestal and part of the cube itself, while the third was aimed at the cave walls. Damn, Bradley exhaled. He stood a few steps away, strong surprise etched in his gray eyes. David had never seen him so agitated. The size of the cave was colossal. The light barely reached the black walls, whose outlines were faintly visible about 300 feet away. The cave floor, within sight, was laid with incredibly black and uniform obsidian slabs. Yeah, you could fit several football fields in here, McKinley shivered. I don't like this at all, boss. Bradley frowned at him and then turned to Stokes. Dave, we need to report this to the leadership. If they find out we're hiding something... He paused, waiting for an answer. I know the protocol, Joe. They'll wait. We have nothing so far except the body of poor Cole. Stokes surveyed the obelisk. We don't even know what this is. He approached the base of the obelisk and forcefully ran his gloved hand over its surface several times. Snow crunched and fell off. David leaned closer, hoping to see something under the layer of snow and ice. But the ice was too thick, and nothing was visible. So he stepped back a bit and struck the surface of the obelisk hard with the heel of his boot several times. There was a crunch. The ice cracked, and thick mat pieces fell loudly into the snow. Damn! Stokes bent down, closely examining the chipped area. Damn, he repeated slowly, shaking his head. This can't be. Footsteps sounded behind him, and Stokes saw a cloud of vapor over his shoulder. Oh my God, McKinley breathed out, his eyes wide open. Silence followed, broken only by the strained hum of the generators. Joe, Stokes was the first to recover. How many heaters do we have left? 2 more. McKinley's voice trembled with excitement. Bring them here. And a couple more generators, quickly. Understood, sir. Stokes bent over the chip again. Under the thick layer of ice, gold gleamed faintly. 8:35 p.m. Another piece of ice loudly fell away from the base, revealing a new section of the structure. Stokes no longer doubted that the entire platform and, probably, the cube itself were made of large blocks of pure gold. He couldn't even estimate how many tons of precious metal there were. 2,000, 3, or maybe 10. David had heard somewhere that Fort Knox held nearly 3,000 tons, and the same amount, maybe more, was right before them. Bradley also seemed to understand what the obelisk was and nervously bit his lips as he examined it. Marty, whom Stokes had urgently called from the station, stood with Steve behind McKinley, quietly and anxiously talking about something. David saw it in their tense faces and the glances they occasionally threw at him and the obelisk. He had left 2 more people above. Frank was securing them at the breach near the equipment, and Tom was on duty at the base to cover them in case of any issues with the management. Another piece of ice crashed onto the stone floor, and another. The heaters were operating at full power. Stokes had them placed around the base of the obelisk and near the cube. While the ice was melting only at the bottom, thin streams of water had just begun to run from the cube. David hadn't decided what they would do with this find, but they had few options. According to protocol, he was obligated to immediately report the incident to his superiors. Of course, the company would give them something as a bonus, but Stokes was absolutely sure that each of them would regret it for the rest of their lives. Or, he thought, they might be able to come to an agreement among themselves. And then there was a slim chance that they could extract all the gold independently. David had connections and hoped to use them if necessary. But he knew that this decision carried great risk because if the venture failed, they would all be out of the company and never be able to work in any major company again. But that wasn't the only thing occupying his thoughts. They still had no idea what they had found or what the cube itself was, positioned on the huge pedestal. The snow on its surface had already begun to melt, and the cube looked as if it were covered with a giant patchwork quilt. Where there was no snow, a thick, shiny layer of ice was visible. What had recently been thin streams of water had already turned into rivulets, quickly running down the wide steps and pooling in clear puddles below. There was a crack. A large fissure appeared on one of the facets, and a moment later, another chunk of ice crashed down, revealing the golden surface. David looked closer. The newly exposed part of the cube was not made of blocks, but was a single monolith, covered with some markings and patterns. Behind him came a loud exclamation. Steve had apparently just realized what the huge structure was made of. Damn. The boy's eyes widened as he took off his glove and ran his hand over the golden wall. Is this gold plating? There must be 100 kilograms here. It's not gold plating, it's solid gold, David said quietly, continuing to carefully examine the strange symbols. Silence fell. Stokes smirked, imagining how the guy's eyes widened again. He climbed the stairs, carefully stepping over thick chunks of ice, and approached the place where the signs were carved. Now David could make out squares, triangles, circles, and other strange symbols that didn't resemble any known script. "Help me," he said loudly, and struck the ice hard several times with the heavy handle of his flashlight. Bradley and McKinley ran up the steps and stood beside him. The others gathered closer to the corners. There were more blows against the ice. Faster. Faster. Stokes wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve and looked at the others. Everyone was gripped by some wild excitement, and each blow left deep dents with white streaks in the ice. He couldn't tell how much time had passed, but suddenly there was a crash, and a huge chunk of ice fell heavily, scattering a cloud of glittering shards. Marty slipped in surprise and fell flat on his back, spreading his arms wide. His flashlight flew far to the side and stuck in the snow. There were joyful shouts and loud laughter. Stokes looked around. Everyone else was on their feet, shaking off snow and ice with eyes gleaming with excitement. Marty, already joking, fell into the snow again, and the guys laughed loudly. His gaze fell on Steve. He stood still, staring at something around the corner of the cube. His face showed confusion and vague anxiety. "Steve?" Stokes called out loudly with a chuckle. "What's over there?" The boy silently raised his hand and pointed to the base of the cube. His face had turned pale. The others also quieted down and stared at what Steve was pointing to. "Oh my God," McKinley said quietly. "What is that?" Stokes walked over to Steve. At first he didn't understand what it was. On one facet, where the ice had fallen away, a golden surface covered with droplets of water was revealed, and on the other, adjacent, from under the him, Stokes felt that the thirst for gold was even weaker than the desire to see the one who had spent thousands of years in the darkness. Bradley's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Sir, I'm ready." He stood next to the giant leg, firmly holding the rope, which was thrown over the back of the throne and secured at his waist. The other end of the rope was in the hands of Steve and Martin. They stood on the opposite side of the cube, waiting for Stokes' signal. "Okay. Lift him up." David motioned with his hand. The rope tightened sharply, and Bradley began to climb, gripping the cracks in the ice. With a few agile movements, he quickly rose to the level of the giant's chest. He slipped, painfully hitting the ice with his hands. He straightened up again, trying to maintain his balance. "Stop!" Stokes waved his hand again. The rope froze in place, holding Bradley from falling. He looked down and smiled. "Guys, anyone brought shorts? It's hot up here." Someone snorted in the radio, followed by muffled laughter. Bradley turned to the giant and, not hurrying, calculating each move, forcefully kicked the ice layer in front of him several times. There was a crack, and another large piece fell, revealing an enormous belly covered in thick, dirty fur. The entire upper part of the body remained hidden under a layer of ice. A heavy, musty smell hit his nose. Joe stood on the thick folds of fat. They were dense and springy. What did this creature eat? He had a wild thought for a second, but he immediately dismissed it. Bradley tried to reach the upper edge of the ice covering the rest of the giant. He couldn't. He put away the flashlight and grabbed the rope again. "Lift me higher." His voice in the radio was broken by static. The rope slowly moved up. Joe leaned back slightly, and with small steps, continued to climb. Everyone silently watched his movements. After a few minutes, he managed to secure himself on the broad chest. He took out his flashlight again, and finally had a look around. In front of him was a huge, ice-covered head. It was at least 8 or 9 feet in size. Under the ice, the thick fur could be faintly seen, with no hint of a face or a snout of an intelligent creature or animal. The ice layer on the right was significantly thinner than in other places. Bradley swung and struck hard with the handle. There was a crack, and a wide fissure ran from the very top to the giant's chest. The ice block hit the edge of the throne heavily, slid down a bit, and stopped. He squinted and leaned closer, trying to see something under the ice, but the spotlight beam hit at an angle, and everything inside the crack was in shadow. "Joe, what do you see?" McKinley was already showing impatience. "Wait a second." Bradley turned on the flashlight and directed the beam inside the crack. The ice was indeed still thick, but water had already formed underneath it. It trickled down the dirty, matted fur and dripped onto the enormous belly. Joe immediately noticed 3 strange black stripes on the head, crossing the fur from one edge of the crack to the other, and looking like shallow folds. Each fold was 12 to 16 inches apart. He leaned closer, slipped his hand into the crack, and carefully touched one of them. At that moment, a wild expression of horror distorted his face. Joe jerked back and, like a fish, began to gasp for air. The folds all opened simultaneously, and 3 huge, shapeless eyes stared at him. Everything else happened in a matter of seconds. There was a deafening crack. Sharp ice shards rained down on Bradley. Heavy chunks fell and trapped his thigh, breaking his leg at the knee. Simultaneously, a massive shadow blocked the spotlight from the left, and a heavy blow to the back like a blunt ram pressed him into the ice. Ribs cracked. He could no longer breathe. His face was forcefully pressed into the hard, like concrete, icy wall. Another push to the back. Ice and bones crunched simultaneously. A new flash of blinding pain shot through his brain. Joe's body, like a rag doll, snapped at the spine with a dry click and quickly disappeared into the black, foul-smelling hole at the bottom of the werewolf's head. 9:53 p.m. Stokes froze in horror. He had just seen Bradley disappear into the werewolf's mouth. The jaws snapped shut with a wet crunch, and streams of blood spattered the dirty white fur of its face and belly. The werewolf swallowed heavily and, lifting its head, roared hoarsely. Everyone scattered in different directions. Stokes fell into the snow and quickly, in a panic, crawled behind the nearest spotlight. His heart was pounding in tight, rapid beats. Blood pulsed in his temples, tearing his head apart. God, what is this? He was breathing heavily. releasing thick vapor into the snow. The spotlight was hot from long use, and it was almost impossible to stay behind it. His entire body and face were covered in sweat. David held his breath and cautiously peeked out. The werewolf was still sitting in the spotlight, its thick, pillar-like legs spread wide, and sharply lifting its head, it inhaled the air noisily. The musky smell from the huge, dirty body filled the entire area. Stokes barely held back his nausea with frequent, shallow breaths. The more Stokes looked at the creature, the more he began to tremble. He could no longer control it, and a wave of wild, primal fear washed over him. A guttural roar sounded again. Everything about the creature's appearance was terrifying. Its body was covered in thick, long fur of a dirty white or rather grayish color. Stokes had seen such fur before on old polar bears. Large bloodstains shone bright red on its chin, chest, and part of its belly. The body was fat, but despite the hanging folds and the huge, protruding belly, it looked powerful and very strong. The remnants of ice crashed down from the throne. What instilled the most fear wasn't even the creature's gigantic size and strength, but its paws and head. Instead of forearms, incredibly thick and long claws hung from its elbow joints. Like the rest of the body, they were covered with fur. Their thickness was staggering, and the surface was dotted with growths that even the dense fur couldn't hide. The werewolf's right claws, splattered with red, hung carelessly from the armrest, with blood dripping and mixing with the melting water on the pedestal. But the head... Stokes began to shake just from looking at it. It was even more repulsive than the two huge claws. The thick fur on it was matted and compressed from being under ice for so long. It wasn't even round, but somewhat flattened in the front, with two large bony growths on the sides where the ears should have been. The werewolf turned its head toward David. Its huge mouth, almost half of its face, was round and looked like a bottomless pit. A guttural roar echoed. For a moment, bare red gums and sharp triangular teeth lining the entire inner surface of the throat appeared. And suddenly, a new wave of terror overcame him. David involuntarily jerked and feverishly tried to press himself into the small space behind the spotlight. He was so overwhelmed by the sight of the werewolf that he only now noticed its eyes. Rather, all three pairs of eyes. They were arranged from top to bottom, three on each side. Large, filled with animal rage and greed, they looked at him wild, merciless, and insane. 10:05 p.m. The werewolf abruptly lifted its head and noisily sniffed the air with its flat, wide nostrils. David realized that it was sniffing for scents, meaning it couldn't see him yet. His throat was dry from the adrenaline rush, and he swallowed convulsively. The generators continued to hum monotonously. The sharp smell of diesel fuel was as strong as the musky scent, and perhaps the only thing that had saved their lives so far. Stokes held his breath and cautiously propped himself up on his elbows. The snow creaked faintly. He stretched his neck as far as his cover allowed and looked around. The bright light illuminated the throne with the werewolf, and beyond, about 15 feet from the pedestal, twilight began. Further still was complete darkness. He prayed that none of the guys would come on the radio now, especially Frank, who stayed above. Any sound would mean death for any of them. The werewolf sniffed loudly and growled in displeasure. David's mind raced. They couldn't run to the ropes. The werewolf would rip them apart or trample them halfway. Even if they managed, they wouldn't climb more than 10 feet. There was a noise again. The werewolf turned its entire body to the right and lifted its head, eagerly sniffing something. Stokes looked in the same direction and realized what had attracted the monster's attention. Nearby lay Cole's flattened body, likely emitting a strong scent of blood. Chunks of ice fell, and one of the blocks hit the edge of the pedestal with a dull thud, breaking into pieces, miraculously missing the right spotlight. The werewolf clumsily and with great difficulty began to rise to its feet, tearing its fur, frozen solid to the ice, from the throne. It swayed from side to side several times, roared in displeasure, and suddenly raised its paws with those horrifying claws. Stokes hunched his shoulders, his eyes widening in fear. His whole body became limp and weak. This couldn't be. There was something unnatural about it. His mind desperately resisted the horrific sight. This mix of different species combined in the nightmarish fantasy of a bad dream. The creature lowered its paws onto the back and armrests of the throne. Even under the thick fur, it was visible how its enormous muscles tensed. Another effort. The ice cracked. It fully straightened on the pedestal, then pushed its chest forward, pulling its paws back, and walked heavily towards Cole's body. Stokes' nerves were at their limit. It was clear they were trapped. His heart pounded loudly in his chest. His throat was so dry that his tongue felt like sandpaper. The footsteps stopped. The werewolf stood over the body like a mountain. Even from here, Stokes could see the red bloodstains on the snow and the pale, miraculously preserved hand with broken fingers sticking awkwardly upward. One of the claws slowly lowered. It moved in strange jerks as if trying to feel something in the air. Then it froze in place, and suddenly darted down, grabbing Cole's body, lifting it sharply to the open mouth, and greedily shoving it inside. The jaws snapped shut, and the sound of bones crunching was heard. The werewolf swallowed again, then roared deafeningly, lifting its head. Stokes curled into a ball, pulled his legs tightly to his chest, and covered his ears with his hands. He was trembling violently. 10:15 p.m. He managed to pull himself together only after a few seconds. Something crashed loudly nearby, and the spotlight suddenly went out. There was a wild scream and the sound of running footsteps. David cautiously lifted his head. One of the generators lay 30 feet away, its metal casing severely deformed. The werewolf stood 45 feet to the left, chest pushed forward, head raised, and wide nostrils flaring. The footsteps faded, and a shadow flickered at the edge of the light and darkness. In that instant, the werewolf darted towards the fading sounds with heavy but quick steps. In a few seconds, it covered the distance and disappeared into the darkness. Stokes propped himself up on his elbows and listened. The silence didn't last long. Suddenly it was pierced by a scream of wild terror and pain. When it fell silent, Stokes heard with horror the same greedy, guttural growl, followed by a loud, prolonged roar. 10:23 p.m. Stokes. The radio suddenly came to life, and a voice trembling with fear and interrupted by static was heard. David flinched in surprise. He didn't recognize who was speaking. The fear had altered the person's voice beyond recognition. "Who's this?" he almost whispered. "It's McKinley." Stokes covered the radio with his hand and listened. Silence surrounded him. The werewolf had either gone deeper into the cave or was hiding somewhere in the darkness. "Got it, John. Who was that?" "Martin. Seems like he snapped from fear and couldn't handle it." "What do we do, David?" McKinley managed to pull himself together. "I have an idea, John. Guys, who else is listening?" "This is Steve." "Frank." Frank's radio signal was heavily interrupted by static. A dissatisfied roar sounded somewhere in the distance. "Steve, John, can you see the ropes well?" "I see them, Dave." "Yes, sir." "Frank? Listening, sir?" "Jerk one of the ropes to make it swing." On it, sir." There was a pause. A few seconds later, one of the ropes jerked slightly and started swinging slowly from side to side. "Okay, Frank. Did everyone see the rope?" "Yes." "Yes, sir. Now listen to me carefully." Stokes tried to speak very quickly. "In at most 2 hours, we'll freeze to death here, so we'll try to get out. Frank, you get on the snowmobile that this rope is tied to and start it." "Understood, sir. Now for you guys. As soon as Frank is ready, one of you runs to the rope and wraps it around yourself. As soon as I give the command to Frank, he quickly drives 100 yards. As soon as he gets one of you up, we repeat everything." He fell silent. The radio was silent. "Might work, Dave," McKinley's voice finally said. "I'm in." "Steve?" "Me too." "Frank, did you hear everything?" "Yes, sir." "Can you do it?" "I won't let you down, sir." "Great. Which one of you, John?" There was a pause. "Think quickly, guys. No time." "Steve," McKinley decided. "Okay, Steve, get ready." "Yes, sir." 10:30 p.m. go. Stokes saw a shadow detach from the base of the throne, and then Steve appeared in the spotlight, running like a rabbit towards the ropes. The snow creaked under his feet, and white clumps flew in all directions. He had to cover 60 feet. He slipped, fell, hitting his palm. Blood splattered. Got up again. For a moment, he appeared in the spotlight and grabbed the rope. Steve's face showed horror. He frantically wrapped the rope around himself, waved his hand. "Lift," Stokes exhaled into the radio. Steve's body jerked and shot upwards. And at that moment, a monstrous bulk emerged from the darkness with incredible speed, and a huge claw grabbed Steve in midair at the waist. There was a horrific scream that was almost immediately drowned out by a deafening animal roar. The werewolf yanked the man down towards its mouth, but feeling the resistance of the rope, it took several steps back and yanked again. Following this, there was a dry, loud crack from above, and a moment later, snow and chunks of ice rained down. And a second later, something large crashed heavily into the rocks with a forceful impact, breaking into several shapeless pieces. The werewolf turned its head towards the sound, but immediately turned back and greedily shoved the still-living, writhing and screaming Steve into its open maw. The screams abruptly stopped, followed by the sound of bones crunching. Stokes' eyes widened in horror, but he wasn't looking at what was left of the snowmobile or even Steve's death. David was looking at McKinley, who was crouched behind another spotlight, and at Frank's body, which lay 10 feet from him. 10:39 p.m. A roar echoed. McKinley pressed his entire body against the back of the spotlight and pulled his legs up. Even through the thick clothing, he felt the unbearable heat of the metal. He couldn't last long, but he had to try. He didn't want to be torn apart. Just the thought of it made John break out in a sweat. He closed his eyes and began to pray. Heavy footsteps sounded behind him, as if someone was pounding concrete pillars into the stone. The hairs on his body stood on end, adrenaline surged, and his terrified heart pounded wildly in his chest like a heavy hammer. The footsteps stopped, and heavy, raspy breathing was heard nearby. The smell of fresh blood and animal stench covered John like a thick, palpable cloud. He covered his mouth with his hand, suppressing his nausea. Tears stood in his fear-widened eyes. God. God. The words pulsed in his crazed mind. John couldn't think. He could barely breathe. He wanted to shrink to the size of a pea or become invisible. The sound of a heavy blow. A guttural growl. A new wave of stench hit him. Something clicked painfully, and a wet crunch of bones followed. He closed his eyes. The crunch continued. John felt he was about to lose consciousness. Black spots danced before his eyes, and his head spun. the rustle of fur. The werewolf swallowed heavily, and suddenly, it became noisy, as if a huge pump was sucking in air through its nose. In that same second, the spotlight flew to the side with a loud clang, catching John's jacket sleeve and spinning him in place. He lay on his back, unable to move or even open his eyes to look directly ahead. His whole body trembled wildly with fear, and his teeth chattered, locking his jaws into cramps. Time froze and turned into a viscous eternity. Finally, he slowly opened his eyes. First, he saw two huge, dirty, fur-covered legs, a belly and chest, bloated with fat and covered with large bloodstains. Something dripped onto his forehead and trickled down his cheek. He looked up and froze, paralyzed with terror. Right above him was the giant head, swaying. The werewolf leaned forward slightly, spreading its massive claws wide and shaking them menacingly. Its face was red with blood, and the fur had clumped into long, ugly icicles. The head turned slightly to the right. John thought the monster was listening for something. Suddenly, one of the claws jerked downward, but stopped and hung a couple of feet above him. The head turned again in the opposite direction, a dissatisfied growl. McKinley feared to breathe and only took shallow breaths through his mouth. The werewolf's monstrous head lowered closer. Now it was no more than 10 feet from the lying man. The nostrils moved again, the mouth opened slightly, and saliva mixed with blood dripped onto John. He couldn't hold it anymore. He screamed, wildly, loudly, with his mouth wide open and eyes bulging. First from fear, then from pain. A furry claw shot down, crushing his body as if it were a paper wrapper, and with a few crunching movements it was shoved into the hungry maw, lifeless and limp, and silence fell again. 10:47 p.m. Stokes rolled onto his back and clutched his head. He breathed quickly and raggedly to suppress his nausea. John's death was wild and horrific. He suddenly turned onto his side and buried his face in the snow. He vomited. It felt a bit better. Wiping the saliva with his sleeve, he cautiously propped himself up on his elbows and peeked out from behind the spotlight. The werewolf was still in the same place, slowly turning from side to side, sometimes lifting its head and sniffing greedily with its wide pink nostrils. All the snow in front of it was splattered with blood. Stokes' pulse was racing, pounding in his temples with tight waves. Moreover, the extended time spent in the snow was starting to take its toll. His hands and feet were gradually going numb from the cold. In at most 2 hours, if he didn't do something, he wouldn't be able to move and would soon freeze to death. Suddenly, David realized he had missed something important. He tried to calm down and started breathing slower. His thoughts flashed like a kaleidoscope. It couldn't be. A flash of insight shot through his mind. He froze, not yet fully believing his guess. This couldn't be. This couldn't be. He looked around. About a yard to the right lay a small piece of the snowmobile's casing, and that was exactly the kind of item he needed now. Small and heavy enough. Stokes cautiously lay down in the snow, trying not to make any loud sounds, then stretched out his right hand and hooked the icy metal edge with his frozen fingers. Damn. His hand slipped. He had to stretch a little further, and only then could he grab the ribbed edge and pull the metal closer to him. He hid again behind the cooling spotlight. The werewolf stood sideways to him, no more than 60 feet away. The light from the remaining spotlights illuminated only the face and part of the chest. This made it look even more terrifying. The beast sniffed the air again, raising its muzzle, then snorted loudly several times and growled in displeasure, releasing a cloud of thick vapor from its mouth. Stokes hesitated. His shoulders and back were shaking so badly that his hands trembled and his neck tensed. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes. Again and again. He held his breath, feeling his body fill with a sense of calm. The trembling began to subside. He exhaled and opened his eyes. He wasn't entirely sure what he was about to do. Maybe he was making a mistake. The last one of his life. Stokes stood up and straightened. The snow creaked. The werewolf turned sharply at the sound, took a quick step and froze. David didn't move. He stared directly at the beast, into its eyes. The enormous head tilted to one side, then the other. The beast noisily sniffed the air, exhaled irritably, pulled its paws back, pushed its chest forward, and roared deafeningly at the man. Stokes' ears popped, but he didn't flinch and remained standing. I'm right. It can't see. It can only hear and smell. His heart pounded wildly from a fresh wave of adrenaline. The werewolf listened again, froze for a second as if thinking, then suddenly rushed at him, claws wide apart. In 3 steps, it covered half the distance. It was enormous. Stokes' hair stood on end. It was incredibly enormous. Another moment, and... As if in a fog, he lifted his unsteady hand with the piece of metal and hurled it with all his might to the side. There was a crash. The beast froze 15 feet from the man and spun around. A thunderous roar echoed, and the massive form lunged toward the sound. David closed his eyes, exhausted, his arms and legs trembling, his back and forehead covered in sticky sweat. There was a prolonged screech of metal. Something heavy scraped against the stones. A loud thud. Something large fell into the snow nearby and rolled over several times. Heavy footsteps. A roar. Another screech of mangled metal, and another thud. Suddenly, there was silence. 11:10 p.m. David didn't know how much time had passed. 5 minutes or much more. He remained standing, drenched in cold sweat and afraid to move. His legs were tired and freezing again. He desperately wanted to take off his boots and rub his numb toes with warm hands. He would do it, but first, he had to survive. Stokes swallowed hard. His throat was dry, and he was very thirsty. His breathing had turned into a thin stream. To avoid making noise, he inhaled in small sips and exhaled just as gently. He could only breathe through his mouth, as his nose was blocked from the intense vomiting. From the depths of the darkness came the wheezing breath of the beast, and he could only guess where it was now. While the generators were running, Stokes had a chance to reach the ropes unnoticed, but now everything had changed. In the ensuing silence, any sound, even the crunch of snow, would cost him his life. David slowly moved his right hand to the place on his belt where the flashlight was attached. There was a rustle of canvas. Damn jacket. He stopped and listened. It seemed to him that the beast's breathing had become quieter. His heart pounded so hard it seemed it would burst through his chest. Just don't make a noise. Stokes' hand reached for the flashlight again. The frozen canvas rustled treacherously, but much quieter this time. Panic was growing inside him. He suddenly remembered the old movie Jaws, which he had watched as a child. The film had made such a strong impression on him that for many years afterward, David had panic attacks when swimming in dark, murky water. And now childhood fears of the unknown made every cell in his body tremble again. His hand touched the flashlight. He carefully pulled it from its holder. A large drop of sweat rolled down his forehead to his eyebrow and hung there heavily. Stokes slowly brought the flashlight to his chest, then raised his left hand and grasped the ribbed handle. Now turn it on. He licked his dry lips. Turning on the flashlight wasn't easy. David remembered with horror that the button made a loud click. To calm himself, he took a deep, careful breath. Then he covered the button with the thick glove, gripping the flashlight handle, and slowly squeezed his hand. After a few seconds, the button clicked silently, and a bright beam of light shot upward. The werewolf was already in another place, much to the left. It crouched and moved in small, silent steps. Its dirty belly hung almost to the stones, and the claws were spread wide and swayed grotesquely with each step. There was something painfully repulsive about this creeping beast, especially the black, blood-covered face which dropped down and sniffed the air after each step. Oh, God. A sharp cramp suddenly seized David's leg. He bit his lip hard to keep from screaming. The pain was unbearable. He arched his back, barely maintaining his balance. The cramp passed as suddenly as it had come, but the terrible realization that he was freezing set in. Meanwhile, the beast had moved further. Stokes tried not to look at its horrifying movements. He only occasionally shone the flashlight in its direction, catching the massive form from the darkness and trying not to lose sight of it. His mind was racing. The flashlight's battery would last at most half an hour, and then he would face complete darkness and a horrible death. The sharp smell of diesel suddenly hit his nose. Stokes looked around. The mangled generator lay about 10 yards to the right. From the beast's powerful blow, it had split almost in half, and a large pool of dark, viscous liquid had formed under it. David shone the flashlight in the beast's direction again. It continued moving and was now almost behind the throne. Its movement strongly resembled a spiral pattern. If that was the case, the beast would be near him in about 10 minutes, Stokes thought. His gaze returned to the diesel fuel. He could try to set it on fire, but the chances of it igniting on the first try were slim, and yes, to hell with it. He dismissed all thoughts and sprinted to the generator like a sprinter, dropping his thick gloves and pulling an old lighter from his pocket. 2 huge steps, and Stokes fell to his knees next to the mangled metal. He paid no attention to the pain from the impact. A thunderous roar echoed, followed by heavy footsteps. Stokes frantically struck the lighter over the pool of diesel. The flame went out, flared again. His hands trembled, sweat pouring down his face. There was still some liquid in the torn tank, and David quickly stuck his hand in. Suddenly the flame flared along with his sleeve. He pulled his hand out of the tank, ran to the side, and fell into the snow. In the same instant, a huge claw closed on the flaming generator. There was a screech of metal. It flew up, and then a deafening roar of pain shook the air. Stokes' ears were temporarily deafened, but he jumped to his feet and ran to the ropes. David had never run so fast in his life, not even when showing off in college to impress the girls. He sprinted in huge leaps, waving the flashlight in all directions. Something fell behind him and exploded. Thick gray smoke began to rise. Stokes didn't look back. He reached the hanging ropes, grabbed one of them, and quickly unclipped the ascender from his belt. He attached it to the rope and began climbing up hastily. 6 feet. The rope was stained with blood, and the ascender slipped sharply down. 9 feet. He looked toward the beast. It was persistently trying to approach the flaming generator, but kept backing away and roaring with rage. The fur on its right claw was severely singed and hung in charred, brownish-black clumps. 15 feet. Stokes' pulse had long exceeded all conceivable limits. His temples throbbed with a tight, pulsing pain. 24 feet. The rope jerked, and he sank a bit, swaying from side to side. 30 feet. Suddenly there was silence. He didn't realize it at first. When he did, cold sweat broke out. 11:35 p.m. Stokes stopped and froze, listening to the ringing silence. There wasn't a sound from below. Only the quiet creak of the rope, stretched under his weight, could be heard. The werewolf was hiding somewhere below, unseen due to the thick haze rising almost to David's feet. He cautiously leaned down and peered into the swirling smoke with its acrid, heavy smell. He could see at most 15 feet. Beyond that, the flashlight beam was lost in the grim depths. Stokes feared to move and just breathed heavily, releasing clouds of white vapor into the icy air. To the left and slightly below, the top of the throne was visible, around which gray smoke also lazily swirled. The beam slid across its dull golden surface and then dissolved again into the darkness. His nerves had long been on edge, and only his iron will allowed David to hold on and not fall into despair. The sound of blood in his ears grew louder, gradually drowning out all other noises. It was terrifying, terrifying beyond measure. He dangled in the air, swaying slightly, once again feeling like bait on a huge hook. The rope creaked again. Stokes raised his head and shone the flashlight upward. The thin line disappeared into infinity, and only it connected him to the outside world. Another creak. He moved his numb hand higher and looked up again. His gaze slid into the darkness, then down the rope, and froze. His heart thudded a few more times and clenched into a tight knot. Not this. He slowly lowered his head and looked down, at the rope he was hanging on, its end lost in the gray haze, directly below him. God, I forgot to pull it up. Stokes gripped the ascender with his left hand and cautiously reached down with his right. His hand trembled with fear. He tried to calm himself. Inhale. His frozen fingers touched the rope. Exhale. His hand grasped the rope and carefully began to pull it up. Inhale. He looped the rope over his neck, lowered his hand again, and pulled up the next section, looped it over his neck. His breathing steadied. Stokes slowly and silently pulled the rope up, loop by loop. His fingers were so numb they moved with difficulty. Finally, David wrapped the last loop around himself, leaned back slightly to keep from spinning, and put his hands in his jacket pockets, feeling the saving warmth spread through his icy fingers. He closed his eyes for a second, just for a second. And then the unexpected happened. The rope jerked and suddenly dropped half a foot, the sharp jolt causing the flashlight to fly out of its holder, spin several times in the air, and fall into the snow, hitting the stones with a loud thud. David quickly pulled his hands from his pockets, grabbed the rope frantically, and froze, swaying slightly from side to side. Miraculously, the flashlight survived. It stuck out of the snow, still shining a bright beam upward. David held his breath, listening intently to the oppressive silence. The seconds stretched into eternity. He looked around cautiously, and suddenly, the hair on Stokes' head stood on end. In the haze where the beam of light was directed, a dense, dark silhouette appeared first, and then the werewolf emerged from the mist. It walked slowly, stopping after each step, listening carefully to the silence, and moving its head in strange, unnatural jerks. At the level of Stokes' legs, there were no more than 5 feet between the man and the beast. A hoarse, muffled growl was heard. The beast took 2 more steps and stopped again. They were now only 2 feet apart. 1 more step, and David could have touched it with his hand. The werewolf lifted its head and turned it toward the man. The flashlight illuminated the snarling face from below, but it was clear to see the blood-splattered fur, the grotesque growths on its head, and the huge, half-open mouth, from which a heavy, rotten, meat-like breath emanated. The beast slowly inhaled, and then snorted loudly, splattering Stokes with murky saliva, growling discontentedly. It tried to sniff the air again, but exhaled noisily once more. Diesel is masking the scents, David guessed. It can only hear. He pressed his lips tightly and cautiously began breathing through his nose. It was much quieter, but the air wasn't enough, and he felt he wouldn't last long. Suddenly, the werewolf extended its snout toward Stokes, coming almost right up to his knees. Now only half a foot separated them. David turned pale with fear. The blood drained from his face, and he clung to the rope, nearly losing consciousness. A burst of vapor escaped the wide nostrils. The blind, absolutely black tarantula-like eyes seemed to be scrutinizing his body, ready to devour it greedily in a moment. His heart stopped. David was about to scream wildly, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the enormous blood-covered snout and insane eyes. The scream stuck somewhere in his throat and his eyes bulged. The next instant, one of the claws shot up and snapped shut with a loud click just a few inches from Stokes' boot. Then slowly lowered, and a thunderous roar filled the cave. The werewolf turned. There was a faint crunch of the flashlight, and everything plunged into darkness. 12:15 a.m. Stokes came to himself only at the top. With difficulty, he rolled onto his back and stared at the dark sky with empty, lifeless eyes. He lay in the snow. The storm had nearly subsided, and the moon appeared in the sky. David didn't remember climbing the rope, clutching it with frost-bitten hands and tearing his palms to the flesh, nor how he had clawed at the ice with broken nails and crawled out, then quickly crawled away from the edge and lost consciousness. The skin on his face hung in tatters, but he didn't feel pain. Now he didn't feel anything at all. David rolled onto his stomach and struggled to his knees. Then, with trembling hands, he pulled out a hunting knife with a broad blade, crawled to the edge of the hole, and with several strong blows, cut through first one rope, then the other. They slid down like snakes and disappeared into the black depths. A prolonged roar echoed from the darkness. Stokes paid it no attention. He got up and staggered toward the nearest snowmobile. The snow had nearly buried all the machines and the tent, turning them into white mounds. Another couple of hours, and there would be no trace left of them. The snowmobile started easily and roared off. He didn't know what he would tell Tom or write in the report, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never tell anyone what really happened here.